Hi, my name is Bridget, Bridget Behan. I will be doing my summary on my research paper for environmental science class with Robert Lovely. So I did my research paper on the American chestnut tree, which was a huge, very significant tree of the eastern United States before it was wiped out by blight in the early 1900s. So I'll kind of go over the history of the tree, the significance, the blight effects that had on the communities, and where the tree is at today. So to start, this tree was the most abundant tree of its native range. Its native range coincides very closely with the Appalachians, so from Georgia to Maine, so pretty much that entire eastern seaboard this tree was there, and it was super, super abundant. One in every four trees was an American chestnut tree. I mean, that's 25% of trees for this huge, huge area. They often grew 100 to 130 feet tall. They were 10 plus feet in diameter a lot of the times. They often lived hundreds and hundreds of years. So it really was just this big, beautiful old growth tree that was just everywhere. Um, so some ecological significance. It's it's very, very abundant. Obviously, like I said, it's super tall, so it provides really good really significant shade for the forest below it. These tall structures were perfect habitat for a lot of wildlife. Birds can safely live way up high. Even the dead trees were significant. There's a lot of animals, birds, and mammals that exclusively live in the hollows of dead trees. So when you have a dead structure that's that big, that one structure is the home for a ton of different animals. Um, and and another thing of significance is, like many other chestnut trees, they have like those big bushy clusters of flowers every spring, which is significant for pollinators of the area. The big thing with the American chestnut, though, is the nuts. They have a much larger nut yield than any other kind of nut producing tree, and these nuts were eaten by just a ton of the animals of the area. Bears ate them like crazy to prepare for hibernation. Turkeys eat them, deer, squirrels, any other mammals, lots of birds. These nuts were a huge food source before winter for a lot of wildlife. But the tree was not only significant for the wildlife of the time, but also for people. So these trees, they were very strong wooded, very tall, very straight. They were huge lumber source for early Americans of the East. And another thing is with these trees, they're very high in tannic acid, which makes them a lot more rot resistant than a lot of other wood, um, which is huge for the time. Um, so the lumber was used for fences, railroad ties, houses, shingles, furniture, telegraph poles, you name it. It was used for it. Another thing for people, obviously, this was also a huge food source as well. With the nuts, because they were so abundant. People would collect them by the wagon full, ship them by the train full to big cities for holidays. A lot of farmers made more money in the fall collecting and selling these nuts than they made from any of their other income all year. So it was a huge piece of income for the people of the Appalachian area. The four biggest the four biggest cash crops of that time were chestnuts, hogs, apples, and moonshine. And the hogs were connected to the chestnuts in that was also their main food source. The hog farmers would just kind of let their hogs loose in the woods to forage for their own food. These nuts were so abundant that property boundaries wasn't even an issue. They would just go corral back in their own hogs, and yeah, that was their main food source. So, in the late 1800s, a fungus was introduced, the chestnut blight, on some imported Asian chestnut wood, and it quickly started killing off the chestnut trees. It was finally noticed and like for the first time actually identified in Brooklyn in 1904, and that's when they kind of noticed and identified the chestnut blight, gave it a name. Um, so this fungus, it kills by producing oxalic acid, which is a chemical that's used as a wood bleach. And what this acid does is it causes a canker, usually towards the base of the tree, that then girdles the whole tree and very quickly kills it. It's very, very lethal for the American chestnut tree. Um, within 40 years, 4 billion American chestnut trees were wiped out. There's out of 4 billion trees, there's only a couple hundred left. So I mean, this was devastating for the people, like both the ecological communities and the human communities of the time. So some of the effects that it had was, as far as people go, it was a huge, huge, huge income loss. Especially because the hogs, that was their main source of food. So now not only are the chestnuts gone, that whole source of income is gone, but the hogs, a lot of farmers couldn't afford to buy enough hog feed to feed their hogs after the chestnuts were gone, because before they were just feeding them for free in the woods. So a lot of hog farmers lost their farms, lost their homes. It was very, very devastating. And there's a lot of animals that also lost their main source of food for that time of year. One of them is the now extinct passenger pigeon. That was a huge food source for that bird as well. So very, very, very big impacts on everybody of the time and place. So where the chestnut tree is at today is, like I said, there's only a couple hundred left out of 4 billion. There's a handful of them out west, a handful in Michigan from pioneers grabbing the nuts and planting them elsewhere. The blight, it can't reach that far. The blight currently lives on in the oak trees of the native range. It doesn't affect the oak trees, it just kind of lives in them. So the oaks are fine. But the blight is now forever a part of the ecosystem of the eastern seaboard Appalachian area. So but a lot of those root systems from those original chestnut trees are still alive underground today, and every year they just kind of send up suckers. But so the root systems aren't resistant to the blight, but there are microorganisms in the soil that protect the roots from succumbing to the same fate as the trees above ground. So when the roots send off these little structures continuously, once they reach, or I'm sorry, not structures, suckers of trees, once those little suckers reach about 5 years old, the blight kills them. So it's just this continuous cycle of tree suckers that just they grow up, then they die, more sprout up, then those die. It's just a continuous cycle. But there are some companies throughout the East that have been trying very, very hard for decades and decades to try and bring back the American chestnut. So the two that I kind of talk about in my paper is that we have the American Chestnut Foundation, and SUNY ESF, which is State University of New York, environmental science, forestry, something like that. But so the American Chestnut Foundation, what they're doing is they're hybridizing trees. So they're trying to create a hybrid between the American chestnut and the Chinese chestnut. And they've been kind of breeding these together for decades, trying to dilute out the Chinese genes. The only gene that they want from the Chinese chestnut is the blight resistance. Otherwise, they want to keep diluting those Chinese genes out to try and get as close to the original American chestnut as they can. But the thing with hybrids is, eventually those trees, no matter how much you dilute it out, they might revert back to having the Chinese behaviors and tendencies as those trees mature. And so it's like you think you have something that's as close to the American chestnut tree as you can be, and then someday that gets older and reverts back to those other tendencies. So that's kind of the downfall of the hybrids. But so the Chinese trees, because they evolved with the blight, they're resistant to it. So you just kind of have to deal with it, with having that. But then the State University of New York is taking a different approach to trying to create a blight-resistant tree by using GMOs. So they've discovered an enzyme in wheat and other grains called oxalate oxidase, and using a bunch of complicated lab processes, they're able to incorporate this gene into the American chestnut tree, using those suckers that are still sprouting up from those root systems. But they're able to incorporate this gene, so the nice thing about this is these trees are fully American chestnut trees. As they mature, they're not going to revert back to having tendencies of Chinese chestnuts or other chestnuts. They're fully 100% American chestnuts, just able to tolerate the blight. Excuse me. But the thing about GMOs is a lot of people are wary about them, because there can be a lot of downfalls with genetically modified organisms and plants and whatnot. So the big concerns that people have is, will this someday become if you release this into the wild, is it gonna someday create some kind of like super fungus for like, is the blight gonna evolve itself into some kind of super fungus because you keep killing it? The answer to that is no. The wheat enzyme doesn't kill the blight, it just makes the tree able to tolerate it, so they can kind of happily coexist together. So there's no reason for the blight to evolve itself into some kind of super fungus. The other big concern people have is this GMO tree gonna, like, how is it gonna affect other wildlife? Is it gonna, like, poison the bees or this or that, And they've been researching it like crazy, doing just countless tests on everything, and as far as the researchers can tell, this tree is no different. With the exception of the blight resistance, this tree is no different than the original American chestnut tree. It doesn't seem to have any harmful effects on the wildlife that they've tested it with. They've tested it with bees, and pollination. They've had tadpoles eating the leaves and stuff. Just everything seems the same. So yeah, these two different companies are both very, very close to having breakthroughs and having the tree finally be approved to be out in the wild and be out in the public. So yeah, this kind of concludes my research paper. So I guess to recap, you have the American chestnut tree, super just big significant tree that was wiped out, and there's just been tons and tons of efforts over the last several decades to bring it back, and I hope that I get to see this come through and this happen. I'll probably never see these trees become the beautiful big mature trees that they can be, but maybe the next generation will be able to witness that, and the next generation after that. So that's kind of the hope there. Yeah, this concludes my summary of American chestnut paper. Thank you.